The morning sun barely filtered through the thin curtains of the one-room apartment on the outskirts of Garings when Mark Davis opened his eyes. The alarm clock read 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was set to go off. In 18 years, he had never learned to sleep peacefully. 15 years in prison had left their mark. He always woke up feeling anxious, as if expecting trouble. Mark got up from the narrow bed, stretched, and glanced at the small mirror above the sink. A 45-year-old man with prematurely graying temples stared back at him with tired brown eyes. The wrinkles around his eyes and mouth told the story of a man who had seen too much. His once athletic physique was now more sinewy but still strong, the result of years of training in the prison yard and hard work in the warehouse. After showering and drinking instant coffee, Mark left for work. The building materials warehouse was located in the industrial area of Garings, a 20-minute walk from his apartment. He preferred to walk. A car was a luxury he couldn't afford, and he didn't want to attract attention. Garing was a typical American town of 8,000 inhabitants, where everyone knew each other and remembered other people's sins for a long time. Founded in the late 19th century as a railway junction, the town slowly declined along with its old industries. The main street was lined with closed shops, and young people were leaving for the big cities in search of a better life. "Good morning, Mark." Joe Kenny, the warehouse manager, nodded to him as he punched his time card. Joe was one of the few who treated him simply as an employee without prying into his past. Perhaps it was because he himself had had problems with the law in his youth. "Morning, Mr. Kenny," Mark replied, putting on his work gloves. The day passed in its usual rhythm, unloading trucks, sorting goods, working with documents. Mark was a good worker, punctual, reliable, and unproblematic. He had learned to keep his head down and not attract attention. His colleagues treated him with cautious respect. Everyone knew his story, but no one spoke about it openly. During his lunch break, Mark sat alone in the corner of the staff canteen, reading the local newspaper, the Garing Courier. On the third page was an article about the upcoming sheriff elections. The incumbent sheriff, Maurice Blake, was running for a fourth term. The photo showed a large man with a gray mustache and the confident smile of a politician. Mark stared at the face for a long time, remembering. 18 years ago, it was Maurice Blake who arrested him for the murder of Louise. Back then, he was a young, ambitious detective eager to make a name for himself on a high-profile case. Mark remembered every detail of that night. How Blake burst into their house with an arrest warrant, how he read him his rights, how he looked at him with contempt and satisfaction. "Mark Davis, you are under arrest on suspicion of the first-degree murder of Louise Davis." Those words still rang in his ears. Back then, in 2007, his marriage to Louise was falling apart. They had married young. He was 22, she was 20. The first few years were happy, but gradually a wall of misunderstanding and mutual recriminations grew between them. Louise dreamed of a big life, wanted to leave Herring, travel, see the world. Mark, on the other hand, was a homebody who preferred the stability and tranquility of a small town. Their arguments became more frequent and louder. The neighbors complained about the noise. Louise started drinking and often disappeared until late at night. Mark suspected that she had another man, but he had no proof. The tension grew like a spring. On that fateful night of March 15th, 2007, they had a particularly violent argument. Louise screamed that she hated him and this damn city, that she wanted to leave and never come back. Mark replied in a rage that she should get out if she felt so bad here. The last thing he remembered clearly was the front door slamming as Louise ran out of the house. The next morning, he woke up with a hangover on the couch. Louise was not home. At first, he thought she had gone to a friend's house to cool off, as she had done before. But when she did not return by evening, he became worried and called the police. After 3 days of searching, a fisherman found her body in the North Platte River, 15 miles from the city. The autopsy revealed head injuries consistent with blows from a blunt object. There were signs of a struggle on the body. The time of death was determined to be the night of March 15th, 16. Mark immediately became the prime suspect. He had no alibi. He spent the night at home alone, drunk. Neighbors confirmed that they heard a loud argument. A baseball bat with traces of blood was found in the house. It turned out to be Louise's blood. The court-appointed lawyer was young and inexperienced. He urged Mark to accept a plea bargain, admit to second-degree murder in exchange for a shorter sentence. But Mark refused. He did not kill Louise, despite all their problems. He loved her. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecutor presented the jury with a story of domestic violence, escalating conflicts, and murder in the heat of passion. Witnesses talked about their fights and how they saw bruises on Louise's arms. Experts explained how the blood got on the bat and how the body ended up in the river. The defense was weak. The lawyer was unable to present an alternative version of events or find other suspects. His main line of defense was that the evidence was circumstantial, but this proved insufficient. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they were asked to stand for the verdict, Mark felt his legs give way. Guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Maurice Blake sat in the courtroom with a satisfied smile. The case had helped him win the sheriff's election. The Nebraska prison system greeted Mark coldly and ruthlessly. The first few years were the hardest. He constantly told anyone who would listen that he was innocent, that he hadn't killed his wife. Most of the inmates were skeptical. They were all innocent. Gradually, Mark learned to survive. He enrolled in a prison education program and earned a college degree. He worked in the library and helped other inmates with legal documents. Every year he filed appeals, but they were all rejected. The years dragged on. Mark grew older, his hair turned gray, and he became more withdrawn. He stopped talking about his innocence. What was the point? No one believed him. He focused on surviving and preparing for his possible release. In 2022, after serving exactly 15 years, Mark was released on parole. The world outside prison walls had changed dramatically. Smartphones, the internet, and social media were everywhere. People lived in a world that seemed alien and frightening to him. Returning to Gering was the only reasonable option. He had no money to move, and the conditions of his release required him to remain in the state under the supervision of a probation officer. Joe Kenny, who had known him before his arrest, offered him a job in a warehouse. Social services helped him find cheap housing. 3 years later, Mark's life had settled into a steady rhythm. Work, home, occasional trips to the grocery store or library. That was his whole world. He avoided crowded places, didn't make friends, and lived like a ghost in his own life. But today, something had to change. After work, Mark decided to drive to Scottsbluff, a neighboring town 30 miles from Gering. He needed to buy new work boots, and the local store didn't have his size. The bus to Scottsbluff took an hour and a half through the dreary landscape of the Nebraska prairie. Mark sat by the window, looking at the endless cornfields and thinking about the past. Sometimes he still saw Louise in his dreams, young, beautiful, laughing. He woke up with a pain in his chest and the realization that she had been dead for 18 years. In Scottsbluff, he quickly found the boots he needed and decided to stop at the supermarket for groceries. The local Walmart was much larger than the store in Gering, with a wider selection. Mark was pushing his cart through the dairy section when he saw her. The woman was standing with her back to him at the yogurt display, studying the labels. Her light hair was pulled back in a ponytail, her shoulders were familiar, and she had the same distinctive curve of the neck. Mark's heart stopped. The woman turned, and he saw the face that had been covered in a coffin 18 years ago. Louise, alive, older but undoubtedly her. Their eyes met for a moment. A flash of recognition flashed across her face. Then she quickly turned away, grabbed the first yogurt she could find, and hurried to the checkout. Mark stood paralyzed, unable to believe his eyes. He forgot the shopping cart and rushed after her, but Louise had already disappeared into the crowd of shoppers. He ran out to the parking lot just in time to see her get into a silver minivan. An unfamiliar man was behind the wheel, and he could see child seats in the back. The car drove away, leaving Mark standing in the middle of the parking lot, feeling like his world had been turned upside down. His wife, for whose murder he had spent 15 years in prison, was alive. The bus back to Gering seemed like the longest ride of Mark's life. He sat in the back row, staring out the window, but seeing nothing. The same thoughts ran through his head. Louise was alive. Louise was alive. And he had served 15 years for her murder. His hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't hold his phone. He tried to dial his lawyer's number several times, but each time he hung up. What could he say? "Hi, remember me? I'm the guy you defended 18 years ago. Well, it turns out my wife is alive." It sounded like the ravings of a madman. When the bus pulled up to the station in Gerings, it was already 7 in the evening. Mark slowly made his way home, each step a struggle. The world around him seemed unreal, like the set of a bad movie. In his apartment, he immediately took an old box out of the closet that he hadn't opened in over a year. Inside were case files, photographs, letters from his lawyer, everything that remained of his past life. With trembling hands, he pulled out a wedding photo. In the black and white photo from 2005, 2 young people were smiling. Mark, in a cheap suit, and Louise, in a simple white dress, were standing in front of the Gering City Hall. They looked happy, full of hope for the future. Mark stared at his wife's face for a long time, comparing it to what he had seen a few hours earlier. The same smile, the same eyes, only now there was something different in them: fear. He didn't sleep all night, tossing and turning in bed and replaying the events of the day. By morning, he had made up his mind. He had to find her and talk to her. He had a right to know the truth. The next day, Saturday, Mark drove back to Scottsbluff. This time he rented an old Ford from a mechanic he knew. He needed mobility for his search. The money he had saved over 3 years of work was melting away, but it didn't matter. He started at the same Walmart where he had met Louise. He spent the whole day sitting in the parking lot, watching the entrance and exit. But she wasn't there. The saleswomen didn't remember a woman matching his description. There were too many customers. On Sunday, he expanded his search. He drove around all the big stores, shopping malls, and restaurants. On Monday, he took the day off work, lying about health problems. Joe Kenny was understanding. Mark had never asked for time off before. By Wednesday, Mark was close to despair. Scottsbluff was bigger than he thought. Nearly 15,000 residents, dozens of neighborhoods, hundreds of streets. Finding one person without an address or last name was almost impossible. On Wednesday evening, just as he was about to give up, luck smiled on him. Driving past the school on Broadway, he saw a familiar silver minivan in the parking lot. His heart beat so fast that he almost crashed into a parked car. Mark parked a short distance away and waited. Half an hour later, the children came out of the school. A boy of about 10 and a girl a little younger. Behind them walked the woman he had been looking for. Louise looked older than he remembered, but she was still beautiful. Her hair was shorter now, and there were wrinkles on her face, but her movements were still as graceful as ever. She was dressed simply in jeans, a sweater, and sneakers. Just a regular mother picking up her children from school. The children ran happily toward her, telling her about their day. Mark saw her smile, stroke their heads, and help them into the car. It was a picture of the perfect family life. When the minivan pulled away, Mark followed at a distance. Louise drove carefully, obeying all the rules, the habit of someone who doesn't want to attract the attention of the police. They drove through the city to a quiet suburban neighborhood with neat houses and well-kept lawns. The minivan turned onto Maple Street and stopped in front of a 2-story house with blue shutters and a large porch. Mark parked at the end of the street and watched in his side mirror. The children jumped out of the car and ran toward the house. Louise got out slowly, looking around cautiously. Caution had become second nature to her. A man came out of the house, the same one Mark had seen driving at Walmart. He was of average height, stocky, with receding hair. He hugged Louise and kissed her on the cheek, the perfect image of a caring husband and father. Mark sat in the car until dark, watching the house. The lights came on in the windows, and he could see silhouettes moving behind the curtains. It was a normal evening for a family. Dinner, helping the kids with their homework, watching TV. Around 9 o'clock, the lights in the children's rooms went out. The adults watched TV in the living room for a while longer. Then it went dark there too. Mark started his car and drove home. Now he knew where she lived. The next day, he returned early in the morning. Around 7 o'clock, a man in a business suit left the house, got into a dark blue Honda Accord, and drove away, presumably to work. Half an hour later, Louise drove the kids to school in a minivan. Mark followed her, traced her entire route, and memorized the times. After school, she stopped at the grocery store, then the pharmacy, then the dry cleaners. The usual errands of an ordinary housewife. By evening, he had put together a rough schedule for the family. The husband worked in an office somewhere in the city center. The children attended elementary school on Broadway, and Louise was a housewife. They appeared to live under the name Collins. He had noticed the name on the mailbox. Mark followed them all week, studying their lives. Gradually, a picture of a happy middle-class American family emerged. The children played sports, the boy played baseball, the girl took dance lessons. On weekends, they went to the park or visited their grandparents. But the more Mark watched, the stronger his rage grew. While he was rotting in prison, Louise was living a full life. She had a new husband, children, a house, and respect in society. Everything that had been taken from him. It was especially painful to watch her play the role of a loving mother. Once, he and Louise had dreamed of having children, but she always put it off, saying she wasn't ready, that she needed to get on her feet first, buy a house, save money. And now she had 2 children with another man. By the end of the second week of observation, Mark realized he couldn't just watch anymore. He needed answers. He had to talk to her. Friday, 6:30 in the morning. Her husband had already left for work. The children were still asleep. Louise came out in her bathrobe to get the mail. Mark got out of the car and walked over to her. She stood with her back to him, looking through letters and bills. Mark stopped a few steps away. "Hi, Louise." She froze, not turning around. The letters fell from her hands and scattered in the wind. "I knew you'd find me sooner or later," she said quietly, still not turning around. "For 18 years I thought you were dead. I spent 15 years in prison for your murder." Now she slowly turned around. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with fear, but not surprise. She knew about his release. "Mark, you don't understand." "Don't understand? I don't understand how my wife could fake her own death and let me rot in prison. I don't understand how she can live peacefully knowing that an innocent man is suffering because of her." "Quiet. You'll wake the children." She glanced back at the house. "Oh, of course. God forbid the children find out that their mother is a liar and a traitor." Tears glistened in her eyes. "You don't know the whole truth, Mark. What happened back then? Then tell me. We have time. We have 18 whole years to make up for lost time." Louise glanced at the house, then at the neighboring windows. "Not here. Let's meet tonight. In the park by the lake at 8 o'clock. I'll explain everything." "How do I know you'll come?" "Because I have to. Because I can't live with this burden anymore." She quickly gathered the scattered letters and hurried into the house without looking back. Mark remained standing on the sidewalk, feeling the adrenaline rush through his veins. He couldn't settle down all day. He drove around town aimlessly, stopped at cafes, but couldn't eat anything. His thoughts were jumbled, his head swarming with questions he wanted answers to. Who was in that coffin? Whose body had been found in the river? How had she faked the autopsy? Who had helped her? Why had she done it? And most importantly, did she know that he would be arrested for her murder? By 8 o'clock in the evening, Mark was already waiting in the park by the lake. It was a quiet place on the outskirts of Scottsbluff, where locals walked their dogs and had picnics. Now, on a cool October evening, the park was almost deserted. Louise arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. She sat down on a bench next to him, but at arm's length. "Start," Mark said. Louise was silent for a long time, staring at the dark water of the lake. Finally, she spoke. "Do you remember what our life has been like these past few months? We were constantly arguing, you were drinking, I was seeing someone else." Mark nodded. He had suspected she was cheating on him, but now he had confirmation. His name was Dan Collins. He worked for an insurance company and often came to Gehring on business. We met at a bar, and one thing led to another. And you decided to fake your death to be with him? Not just for that. Louise took a pack of cigarettes out of her pocket and lit one with trembling hands. Remember the life insurance policy we took out in 2006? For $500,000? Mark remembered. At the time, it had seemed like a sensible decision. A young family needed to protect itself from unforeseen circumstances. Dan came up with a plan. We would fake my death, collect the insurance money, and start a new life under different names. He knew how to do it. He had connections in the police and in the medical examiner's office. Maurice Blake, Mark guessed. Louise nodded. Dan and Maurice went to college together and were friends. Maurice needed money, divorce, alimony, debts. Dan offered him a share of the insurance money in exchange for his help. The picture was starting to become clearer. And whose body was found in the river? Jane Doe from the Scottsbluff morgue. A woman about my age, no identifying marks. Died of a drug overdose. Maurice switched the documents, and the medical examiner was his friend. And the blood on the baseball bat? Mine. I cut my finger before I left and dripped it on the bat. I thought it would make it look more convincing. Mark felt rage growing inside him. And it didn't occur to you that I would be arrested? Tears streamed down Louise's cheeks. Dan said that without a body and direct evidence, the case would be closed. We didn't know they would find another body. By the time it became clear that you would be charged, it was too late to change anything. Too late? You could have come forward and told the truth? And then what? We would all have gone to prison for fraud. Dan said a good lawyer would get you acquitted. They had no hard evidence. But I was found guilty. I know. Louise's voice broke. Every day for the last 18 years, I've thought about it. Every night I see your face in my dreams. I wanted to tell you 1,000 times, but what? But the new life was too good to give up? Louise didn't answer. They sat in silence, listening to the wind rustling in the trees. What now? She finally asked. Mark thought long and hard about his answer. Part of him wanted to strangle her right there on the bench. Another part felt a strange sense of relief. At last he knew the truth. I don't know, he said honestly. I need time to think. Mark, please, the children are not to blame. Whatever you decide, think about them. He got up from the bench. 18 years ago, you had someone else to think about. Mark walked to his car, leaving Louise crying in the dark. One thought ran through his mind. What to do with the information he had received? Go to the police, demand a review of the case, or take justice into his own hands. Mark didn't sleep all night after meeting Louise, sitting at the kitchen table and thinking about what he had heard. Dawn found him with a cup of cold coffee in his hands and a clear plan of action in his head. First, he needed proof. Louise's confession in the park was worthless without confirmation. Any prosecutor would laugh at a story about a convicted murderer meeting his dead wife. He needed documents, records, something tangible. Mark took an 18-year-old phone book out of a box and found the number of his former lawyer. Robert Clark was a young lawyer in 2007, just starting his practice. Now, if he was still working, he must have gained some experience. The number was no longer in service. Mark drove to the Herring Library and used a computer to find Clark online. It turned out that he now had his own practice in Omaha, specializing in criminal cases. Robert Clark, attorney, a woman's voice answered. I need to speak to Mr. Clark. Mark Davis. He defended me in 2007. Pause. One moment, please. A few minutes later, a familiar voice answered, only more confident than 18 years ago. Mark, my God, is that really you? I heard you were released 3 years ago. Bob, I need help. Urgently. It's about my case. Mark, we've exhausted all avenues of appeal. The case is closed. You've served your time. My wife is alive. A long pause. What did you say? Louise is alive. I met her a week ago in Scottsbluff. She confessed that she faked her death. Mark, listen to me carefully. I understand how hard it is to come to terms with what happened, but fantasies won't help. These aren't fantasies, damn it! I spoke to her. She's living under the name Helen Collins. She has a new husband and 2 children. Clark sighed. All right, if you're telling the truth, That changes everything. But I need proof. Can you come to Omaha tomorrow? With photos, documents, everything you have? I'll be there by noon tomorrow. After hanging up, Mark felt the first spark of hope in many years. But first, he had to gather evidence. He returned to Scottsbluff and spent the entire day photographing the Collins house. Louise, with her children at school, their family outings, even their license plate numbers. Every photo could be proof that Louise Davis was alive. That evening, he followed Dan Collins to his office in the city center. Mountain States Insurance occupied the second floor of an old bank building. Mark memorized the address. Perhaps the policy payment documents were kept there. The next day, he drove to Omaha. The city greeted him with hustle and bustle. After quiet herring, it was almost a shock. Clark's office was in the business district, in a modern glass and steel building. Robert Clark had aged and grayed, but he looked more confident than he had 18 years ago. An expensive suit, a gold watch, a leather executive chair, a successful lawyer, a far cry from the young court-appointed attorney. "Show me what you've got," he said, seating Mark across from his desk. Mark laid out the photographs, his notes, and copies of insurance documents. Clark studied every detail carefully, jotting things down from time to time. "There is a physical resemblance," he finally admitted, "but that's not enough. We need an expert opinion, a DNA test, official identification. And most importantly, we need to prove that it's your wife and not just a woman who looks like her. She admitted it to me herself. Without a recording, it's your word against hers. And you're a convicted murderer. She's a respectable housewife. Guess who the court will believe?" Mark clenched his fists. "Then what do? We need to gather real evidence. Documents about the body swap, recordings of conversations with accomplices, bank transfers of insurance money. This is a serious investigation, Mark. It will take time and money. How much?" Clark named a sum that exceeded Mark's entire income for 3 years. "But if we prove your innocence, you can file a claim for compensation. The state of Nebraska pays $50,000 for each year of wrongful imprisonment. So I'm owed $750,000? If we prove it. That's a big if." Mark knew he had no choice. "Get to work. I'll find the money. In the meantime, start gathering information, but be careful. If Blake is really involved, he's dangerous. A corrupt sheriff with powerful connections is not someone to be underestimated." On the way home, Mark thought about the lawyer's words. Blake was indeed dangerous. Over the past 18 years, he had consolidated his power and gained influence in the police and the courts. A direct confrontation would be suicide. But Mark had an advantage. No one knew that he knew the truth. As long as he was careful, he could act inconspicuously. Back in Gering, he went to the local library and asked for the March 2007 issues of the Gering Courier. The librarian, an elderly woman named Miss Henderson, looked at him suspiciously. "What do you want with old newspapers, Mr. Davis?" Mark knew that everyone in town knew his story. "I want to refresh my memory of that time. Try to understand what happened back then." Miss Henderson brought him a stack of newspapers. Mark found the March 18th, 2007 issue. On the front page, in large letters, "Body of missing woman found." Below was a photo of Louise and brief information about the discovery in the river. More interesting was the article on the third page. "Sheriff Blake promises quick investigation." The article described the police's actions in detail and quoted Blake as saying that the culprit would be found as soon as possible. "We will not let this case go unresolved," Blake said at the time. "Justice will prevail." How right he was, Mark thought bitterly. Only justice was not on his side. Over the next few days, he pored over the archives, gathering information about the investigation. Gradually, a picture emerged of how Blake had masterfully steered the investigation in the right direction. By the second day after the body was found, all attention was focused on Mark. Witnesses talked about family quarrels. Neighbors recalled screams coming from the Davis home. The autopsy confirmed the victim's identity and cause of death. The case was closed with impressive speed. Usually, such investigations drag on for months, but here, less than a week passed between the discovery of the body and the arrest. Too fast, even for an obvious case. Mark understood that Blake was in a hurry to close the case before any inconvenient questions arose. The longer the investigation lasted, the greater the risk of exposure. On Friday evening, while studying another stack of newspapers, Mark noticed a small article dated March 25, 2007. Local businessman receives large insurance payout. The article reported that the Davis family had received $500,000 from the life insurance policy of the late Louise Davis. Mark Davis was listed as the beneficiary as the legal spouse, but he never saw the money. He was already in prison at the time, so someone else had received the money on his behalf. Most likely, Blake, using his authority and forged documents. This was the first lead that could be checked. Insurance companies keep detailed records of all payments. If records of where the money went could be found, the whole scheme could be unraveled. On Saturday morning, Mark decided to take bolder action. He drove to Scottsbluff and parked across from the Mountain States Insurance office. He spent the entire day observing the building, studying its operating hours, security, and number of employees. Around 6 in the evening, Dan Collins emerged from the building. Mark followed him, keeping his distance. Dan drove to the Silver Dollar Bar, a popular meeting place for local businessmen. Mark parked a short distance away and waited. Half an hour later, a Ford Explorer police car with Scottsbluff County Sheriff's Department markings pulled up to the bar. A familiar man in uniform got out of the car. Maurice Blake had aged and put on weight. His mustache was completely gray, but Mark would have recognized him among 1,000. The man who had ruined his life calmly headed into the bar, apparently to meet his accomplice. Mark felt rage boiling in his chest. Here they were, the two men who had stolen 18 years of his life, calmly drinking beer and probably dividing their loot. He wanted to burst into the bar, grab them by the throat, and force them to confess. But he knew that would be the end of everything. A drunken fight with the sheriff would mean going back to prison, this time for good. Mark forced himself to calm down and continued watching. Blake spent about 2 hours in the bar, then came out clearly drunk. Dan stayed inside. When Dan finally left the bar, it was late. He got into his Honda and drove home. Mark followed him, thinking about what he had seen. Blake and Dan's regular meetings could only mean one thing. Their connection was not limited to events that had taken place 18 years ago. Perhaps they had other things in common, other crimes. This opened up new possibilities. If he could prove that Blake and Dan were currently involved in fraud, it would attract the attention of the federal authorities. And the feds weren't as loyal to local sheriffs as the local police were. On Sunday morning, Mark met with the detective who changed everything. Rita Morgan was a woman in her 50s with a hard face and piercing gray eyes. She had been with the Scottsbluff Police Department for 25 years and had a reputation as an incorruptible and honest cop. Mark found her at Rosie's Diner, where she was eating breakfast alone, reading the newspaper and sipping coffee. "Detective Morgan, my name is Mark Davis. May I sit down?" She looked up from her newspaper and gave him a searching look. "Davis is a name I'm familiar with. You're not the guy who—" "Yes, I'm the one. The one who allegedly killed his wife 18 years ago." "Allegedly?" Rita put down her newspaper. "As far as I remember, you were found guilty. And I spent 15 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit, because my wife is alive." Detective Morgan looked at him closely. There was no mockery or disbelief in her eyes, only professional interest. "Sit down," she said finally, "and tell me everything from the beginning." For the next hour, Mark recounted his story in detail. Rita listened silently, asking only a few questions to clarify. When he finished, she stared out the window for a long time, thinking about what she had heard. "You see, Mr. Davis, your story sounds incredible. But I've known Maurice Blake for 20 years, and there's always been something about his work that I found suspicious." "What exactly?" "Too many successful cases, too many quick investigations, too many convenient coincidences. And then there's his lifestyle, which doesn't match a sheriff's salary." Rita took her phone out of her pocket. "I'm going to conduct a little informal investigation. If you're telling the truth, justice should prevail, even if it's 18 years late." "Why do you believe me?" "I don't yet, but I'll check it out. I have access to archives, databases, contacts in other states. If Louise Davis is really alive, I'll find her. Mark felt a surge of hope. Finally, he had an ally, a professional who knew how to work with evidence. What should I do? Keep watching, but be careful. Don't take any action without my knowledge. And most importantly, don't say a word to anyone about our conversation. If Blake finds out that we're investigating his case, we could both be in danger. They exchanged phone numbers and agreed to meet in a week. Rita promised to check the databases and find traces of Helen Collins. Leaving Scottsbluff, Mark felt for the first time in many years that he was not alone in his fight for justice. He had allies, a plan of action, and real hope for restoring his good name. But he didn't know that his meeting with Detective Morgan had already been noticed. In the corner of the cafe, a man in a baseball cap sat at a table, listening intently to their conversation. Half an hour after Mark left, the man called Sheriff Blake. "Boss, we have a problem. Davis met with Detective Morgan. They talked for a long time and exchanged phone numbers." "I see," Blake replied coldly. "It looks like our old friend has decided to play detective. It's time to take action." A week of tense waiting passed. Mark continued to work at the warehouse, trying to act normal, but every phone call made him jump. Rita Morgan promised to contact him as soon as she found anything in the databases. The call came on Wednesday evening as Mark was having dinner in his small apartment. "I have news," Rita said without preamble. "Helen Collins has officially existed since April 2007. Driver's license, social security, tax returns, all the documents appeared a month after Louise Davis had died. So it's really her. What's more, I found bank records. In May 2007, Dan Collins received $500,000 from Mountain States Insurance. Officially, it was a payment on Louise Davis's insurance policy." Mark clenched the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Do you have proof?" "Copies of documents, bank statements, records of phone calls between Blake and Collins in the days after the murder. That's enough to open an official investigation." "When?" "I'm filing a report with the district attorney tomorrow morning. By evening, there will be arrest warrants for all three of them." Mark felt dizzy with relief. 18 years of waiting were coming to an end. "Thank you, Detective. Don't thank me yet. Be careful until tomorrow. If Blake suspects anything, he may try to cover his tracks or get rid of witnesses." After the conversation, Mark couldn't sit still. He paced around the apartment, planning his future. Compensation from the state, a new case against real criminals, the chance to finally clear his name. But what tormented him most was the question: what would happen to Louise's children? They weren't to blame for anything, but their world was about to collapse. Their mother would be exposed as a criminal, and their father would be arrested for complicity in fraud. By midnight, Mark had made up his mind. He had to talk to Louise again, warn her about the impending arrests. Maybe she could prepare the children somehow, soften the blow. On Thursday morning, he took the day off and drove to Scottsbluff. Everything looked quiet at the Collins house. Dan had left for work and the children were at school. Louise was home alone. Mark parked a short distance away and waited for the right moment. Around 10 o'clock, Louise came out to water the flowers on the porch. She was dressed casually in old jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Mark got out of the car and headed for the house. Louise saw him when he was halfway across the yard. Her face paled, and she dropped the garden hose. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, glancing at the neighboring houses. "We need to talk, right now." "I told you everything last time. There's nothing more to talk about." "You're all going to be arrested tonight," Mark said bluntly. "You, Dan, and Blake. The police have proof." Louise staggered and grabbed the porch railing. "What kind of evidence?" "Bank records, insurance documents, phone records, everything they need to charge you with fraud and perjury." "My God," Louise sank down onto the porch steps. "What will happen to the children? That's what I wanted to talk about. Do you have any relatives who could take them in? At least temporarily?" Tears streamed down Louise's cheeks. "My sister is in Denver. But how can I explain this to her? How can I tell the children?" "The truth," Mark replied harshly. "It's time to stop lying." "You don't understand. These children are my life. For the last 10 years, I've been a real mother to them. They love me, they trust me. And I didn't deserve your trust? Didn't I love you? Louise looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. Mark, I know I did a terrible thing. Every day for the last 18 years, I've regretted it. But there's nothing we can do to change it now. You could have changed it 18 years ago. You could have changed it when I was arrested. You could have changed it during the trial. Mark didn't notice how loud he had become. The anger that had been building up for years was starting to break through. Do you think it was easy for me? Louise shouted back. Do you think I didn't suffer? Every night I saw you in my dreams. Every time I watched the news about prisons, I imagined you there. But not enough to confess. What good would it have done? It wouldn't have freed you, and it would have destroyed my new family. Your new family, built on lies and other people's suffering. They shouted at each other, not noticing their neighbors peeking out of their windows. 18 years of pain and resentment poured out. You know what? Mark grabbed Louise by the shoulders, forcing her to look him in the eyes. You're going to the police right now and telling them the whole truth. Voluntarily, it might get you a lighter sentence. Let me go! Louise tried to break free. Only after you promise to make the right choice. Finally, get your hands off her! The voice came from behind Mark. He turned and saw Dan Collins standing on the driveway. He was holding a baseball bat. Dan, don't, Louisa began. Shut up, her husband interrupted. I told you sooner or later this bastard would show up and start blackmailing us. Mark let go of Louise and slowly turned to Dan. I'm not blackmailing anyone. I just want justice to prevail. Justice? Dan sneered. You want to ruin innocent people's lives for your own revenge. Innocent? Are you serious? My children are innocent. Louise has started a new life. She's a different person, and you're just a bitter loser who can't come to terms with the past. Mark felt rage boiling up inside him. You stole 18 years of my life from her. No one stole anything. You destroyed your own marriage, drove your wife to despair. She just found a way to start over. At my expense. What did you lose, really? The life of a drunk in a godforsaken town? A job as a dock worker? We did you a favor. Mark took a step forward. Dan raised the bat. Dan, stop, Louise intervened. Mark, go away. Please, forget about it. Live your life. How can I forget? How can I live knowing that criminals are free? We're not criminals, Dan said. We're just people who wanted to be happy. At the expense of someone else's happiness. Enough philosophy, Dan said, gripping the bat tighter. Now you're going to get out of here and never come back. Otherwise... Or else what? Kill me? How convenient. Blame it all on me again. If I have to. Mark saw the determination in Dan's eyes. This man was truly willing to kill to protect his secret. Louise, Mark said, keeping his eyes on Dan. You have one last chance to do the right thing. The police already know the truth. A voluntary confession is the only way to protect the children. She's not going anywhere, Dan said. And you'll forget everything you know. I won't forget. Then you're finished. Dan swung the bat. Mark tried to dodge it, but it was too late. The blow struck his temple with such force that the world spun around him. Mark fell to his knees, feeling warm blood running down his face. Louise was screaming something, but her voice sounded distant. The second blow hit the back of his head. Mark collapsed face down in the grass, feeling the strength leave him. Dan, what have you done? Louise screamed. What I should have done 18 years ago, Dan replied, looking at the bloodied bat. Mark tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't obey him. Black circles swam before his eyes. We have to call an ambulance, said Louise. No. First, we have to think about how to explain everything. He's dying! Good. One less problem. The last thing Mark had time to think before sinking into darkness was, Rita will find out the truth. She won't let them get away with this. Then there was silence. Dan Collins stood over the body, breathing heavily. He was still holding the bat, covered in blood and hair. What do we do now? Louise whispered. We'll figure something out. We'll say he attacked you and I was defending myself. Self-defense. But the neighbors heard the fight. All the better. That means he had a motive for attacking you. Louise stared at the motionless body of the man who had once been her husband. God, what have we done? "We protected our family," Dan replied harshly, "and we'll keep protecting it." He took out his phone and dialed 911. "Police, I need help. A man attacked my wife and I had to stop him. Yes, he's dead. Address." Mark Davis, who spent 15 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, died in his wife's backyard, never seeing justice. But his death was not in vain. In his jacket pocket was a recording device that had been left on, which recorded the entire conversation with Louise and the murder committed by Dan Collins. An hour later, police cars and an ambulance arrived at the house on Maple Street. But it was too late for Mark. Detective Rita Morgan, having received a report of the death of a man she had met a week earlier, personally arrived at the scene. She knew it was no accident. Detective Rita Morgan stood in the cordoned-off yard of the house on Maple Street, looking at the body of Mark Davis. Yesterday, this man had been full of hope for justice, and today he lay dead in a pool of blood. "What are the witnesses saying?" she asked Sergeant Thompson. "Dan Collins claims that the deceased attacked his wife. He says he was defending himself. Neighbors confirm that they heard a loud argument." Rita carefully examined the scene. The body was lying face down, a bloody bat lying nearby. 2 deep blows to the head, one to the temple, the other to the back of the head. "Strange self-defense," she muttered. "Usually in cases like this, 1 blow is enough. Maybe he was high on drugs? Didn't feel any pain? Let's do an autopsy." Rita approached the forensic expert. "What do you think, Mike?" Mike Renner had been working as an expert for 20 years and was rarely wrong. The first blow was to the left temple, and the victim fell. The second blow was to the back of the head while she was already lying down. It was fatal. So the killer finished off a man who was already down? It looks that way. That's a lot for self-defense. Rita nodded. Her suspicions were confirmed. This was murder, not self-defense. "Where's Collins?" "In the house, giving a statement to Detective Harris." Rita entered the house. Dan Collins, a middle-aged man with receding hair and a blood-stained shirt, was sitting in the living room. Next to him on the sofa was a woman with light hair, cowering. "Detective Harris, can I have a word?" They went out into the hallway. "What's the suspect saying?" Rita asked. "The usual story. The deceased attacked his wife. He was defending himself. He says this Davis had been there before and threatened them." "And what does the wife say?" "She confirms her husband's story, but she looks very frightened." Rita returned to the living room. "Mr. Collins, I'm Detective Morgan. Tell me again what happened." Dan looked up. Fear flashed in his eyes, but his voice sounded confident. "I came home from work and saw this man grabbing my wife by the shoulders, shouting at her. She was begging for help." "What time was that?" "Around 10:30 in the morning." "Why were you at home during working hours?" Dan hesitated for a moment. "I forgot some important documents and came back to get them." Rita wrote down the answer. "Continue." "I asked him to let my wife go. He started threatening me, waving his arms around. I grabbed a bat to scare him off, but he lunged at me. I had to defend myself." "And you hit him twice?" "I don't remember. It all happened so fast. I was afraid for my wife and children." Rita turned to the woman. "Mrs. Collins, do you confirm your husband's statement?" Louise nodded without looking up. "Yes, that's exactly how it happened." What was the deceased shouting about? Some kind of incoherent nonsense? Something about prison, about injustice? He was clearly not himself. Rita watched the woman's reaction closely. Each question made her cringe even more. "Did you know Mark Davis before?" "No, I've never seen him before," Louise replied quickly. "Then why did he come to you?" "I don't know. Maybe he got the wrong address." Rita nodded and closed her notebook. "Thank you. We'll be in touch if we need any more questions." Leaving the house, she approached the forensic investigator. "Mike, search the body thoroughly. Look for everything. Phone, notes, documents. Already on it. By the way, here's something interesting." He handed her a small voice recorder. "Found it in the victim's jacket pocket. The record button is pressed." Rita's heart began to race. "Does it work?" "Yes, and there's something recorded on it." They got into the patrol car and turned on the recorder. At first, only footsteps and the sound of the wind could be heard. Then Mark's voice rang out. "You're all going to be arrested tonight. You, Dan, and Blake. The police have evidence. Then a woman's voice. What evidence? Bank records, insurance documents, phone records? Rita listened to the recording, and the picture of what had happened became clearer. This was not a chance meeting, but a planned conversation. Mark knew this woman, knew about some crimes. The recording continued. An argument, threats, then Dan Collins' voice. Get your hands off her! The sound of a struggle, screams, then a blow, and another. Dan, what have you done? What I should have done 18 years ago. We need to call an ambulance. No, first we need to think about how to explain everything. He's dying! Good, one less problem. Rita turned off the tape recorder. Now she had evidence of premeditated murder. But the recording contained much more information. She took out her phone and called the district attorney. Jim, I have a murder case. I need immediate arrest warrants for Dan and Helen Collins, and for Sheriff Maurice Blake. Blake? Are you sure, Rita? I have a recording that proves their involvement in fraud 18 years ago, and today's murder is connected to an attempt to cover up those crimes. An hour later, several police cars pulled up to the Collins house. Dan and Louise were arrested on charges of first-degree murder and fraud. Maurice Blake's arrest was more dramatic. When detectives arrived at his office with a warrant, he tried to escape through the back door. He was apprehended in the parking lot as he attempted to get into his car. "This is a mistake!" Blake shouted as he was being handcuffed. "I've served this county honestly for 20 years!" "Honestly?" Rita sneered. "Tell that to Mark Davis's family." That evening, the most high-profile investigation in the history of Scotts Bluff County began. The tape recording became key evidence, but Rita and her team gathered additional clues. Bank records showed that the insurance money had indeed been deposited into Dan Collins' account. Part of the money was transferred to an offshore account registered to a frontman who turned out to be connected to Maurice Blake. Medical records from the Scotts Bluff morgue confirmed the body had been switched. Jane Doe, who had died of an overdose, had been illegally identified as Louise Davis thanks to forged documents. The forensic expert who conducted the examination in 2007 turned out to be an old friend of Blake's. Under pressure from the evidence, he confessed to falsifying the DNA test results. The case received widespread media coverage. Corruption in the Nebraska police, innocent man spent 15 years in prison, wife faked her own death. Headlines screamed from newspapers across the state. The trial began 6 months later. Dan Collins was charged with first-degree murder, Louise with accessory to murder and fraud, and Maurice Blake with corruption, fraud, and abuse of office. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The main piece of evidence was a recording from Mark Davis's tape recorder, which clearly demonstrated the motives and circumstances of the murder. Dan Collins tried to insist on a self-defense version, but the recording refuted his testimony. The jury heard him calmly discussing the death of a man and planning to cover up the crime. Louise testified against her husband, hoping for leniency. She gave a detailed account of the plan to stage the death, Blake's role in forging documents, and how they divided the insurance money. "I regret what I did," she said in court, addressing Mark's family. "Every day for the last 18 years, I have thought about him, but my fear for my children and for a new life was stronger than my conscience." Maurice Blake refused to testify, but his bank records spoke for themselves. Over the years as sheriff, he had amassed a fortune several times his official salary. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict was unanimous. Dan Collins was guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Louise Collins, née Davis, was found guilty of fraud, accessory to murder, and perjury. The sentence was 25 years imprisonment. Maurice Blake was found guilty of corruption, fraud, and abuse of office. The sentence was 20 years in prison. After the verdict was announced, Rita Morgan held a press conference. "Justice has been served, albeit 18 years late," she told reporters. Mark Davis was an innocent man who fell victim to a cynical conspiracy. His memory has been restored, his name has been cleared. The state of Nebraska paid compensation to Mark's heirs, his elderly mother and cousin. The amount was $750,000, $50,000 for each year of wrongful imprisonment. The Collins children were taken in by Louise's sister in Denver. 10-year-old Tommy and 8-year-old Sarah were too young to understand the full extent of the tragedy, but the older boy often asked when his mom and dad would be coming back. A year later, Rita Morgan stood in the cemetery in Gering in front of Mark Davis's grave. The new headstone was engraved with the inscription, "Mark Davis, 1982 to 2025, an innocent man, a victim of injustice. Your memory has been cleared." "We're sorry, Mark," she whispered. "We were too late." The Davis case was a turning point in Nebraska's law enforcement reform. Homicide investigation procedures were tightened and additional checks were introduced to prevent corruption. Robert Clark, Mark's former lawyer, established a fund to help the wrongfully convicted. "Mark believed in justice until the very end," he said at the fund's presentation. "We must ensure that his tragedy never happens again." Detective Rita Morgan received an award from the state governor for her outstanding service in the fight against corruption. But for her, the greatest reward was knowing that justice had prevailed. Justice came too late for Mark Davis. He did not live to see the day when his name was cleared and the real criminals were punished. But his death was not in vain. It uncovered a truth that had been hidden for 18 years. In the Scotts Bluff County Police Department archives, case number 2007-0315 was reclassified, closed, defendant posthumously exonerated, real criminals punished.